Good evening and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas online lecture series. Tonight partnering with the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Firstly, as a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which the university is situated, the Palawa people, and the custodians of the land upon which we meet, and other custodians around the country. Pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Marcus Howard. I'm a professor of Antarctic and Ocean Governance at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies at the University of Tasmania. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this presentation. The Island of Ideas program commenced last year to keep discussion and ideas flowing when we were having difficulty hosting live public events. The program will continue in 2021 as a mixture of online and on-campus events, as the safety and student, staff, and community is still the highest priority of the University of Tasmania. Each year, the university presents hundreds of forums, seminars, lectures, and workshops to nurture discussion of the ongoing learning of our students, alumni, and the wider community. Over the past 18 months, over 23,000 community members have participated in the Island of Ideas series. These are important parts of the university's role, and it's why we're hosting a forum such as tonight's. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get underway. Your microphone, camera, chat function, and raised hand function have all been disabled, so our speakers are not interrupted. We do encourage you to ask questions, and this can be done through the Q&A function you'll see on your screen. You can ask questions anonymously, and a selection of these questions will be answered in the Q&A session towards the end of the discussion after our speakers have finished their presentation. We'll be conducting several audience polls during the webinar, the first of which is now on your screen, so feel free to participate if you would like to. And finally, this lecture is being recorded for later access on the YouTube and SoundCloud channels. So, as the slide says, the topic tonight is the Antarctic Treaty, Nature, Peace and Science. And I was just reflecting this today, very appropriate to talk about the Antarctic on how cold it was and miserable it was in parts of Hobart today. But I'd like to first introduce my colleague, Dr. Tony Press, former director of the Australian Antarctic Division and an adjunct professor at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Affairs, to moderate the panel and introduce the speakers. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much. I just had a slight difficulty there. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this very significant seminar. 60 years ago in Canberra, on an equally bitter and cold set of weeks, the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, the very first of its kind, the first meeting that was held after the negotiation of the Antarctic Treaty, was underway in Canberra. It concluded on the 24th of July. Australia was at first a reluctant participant in the discussions about establishing a treaty, but significantly, Australia played a very important role in the final form of the Antarctic Treaty and played a very significant role in calming the tensions that were around in the Cold War, the late 1950s, around the status of Antarctica and the status of claims to parts of Antarctica. The meeting in Canberra was opened by Robert Menzies, who was the Prime Minister of Australia at the time. And in that meeting, he referred specifically to Richard Casey, who had been deeply engaged in Antarctic affairs for many decades. He was then, as the treaty was being negotiated, the Minister for External Affairs. But by the time the first Antarctic Treaty meeting was being held, he was actually in St. Petersburg, as it is now, visiting the Russian Antarctic Institute. So 60 years, the treaty still exists, it's still held together, it's gone from 12 signatories to 54. And today's seminar is discussing two aspects of the Antarctic Treaty and the significance of those 60 years, and a bit of a peek into our presenters' views of what the future may be. So the first speaker I would like to introduce is Bruno Arpi, who's going to talk about 60 years of the Antarctic Treaty. So over to you, Bruno.
Thank you very much, Tony and Marcus. Let me share my screen first. Okay, good afternoon. First, I would like to thank the Tasmanian branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the University of Tasmania for organizing this event. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Well, we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of the entry into force of a remarkable treaty. And it's remarkable because from this treaty, the states active in the region have developed an international framework that has allowed countries with different and sometimes even conflicting interests to peacefully cooperate in Antarctic affairs. So cooperation is in the spirit of the treaty. Thanks to this international instrument, the area below 60 degrees south has been free of armed conflicts and successfully managed geopolitical tensions during the last 6 decades. Geopolitical tensions were a key factor in the adoption of the Antarctic Treaty and also has shaped the further evolution of Antarctic governance. So during my talk today, I will try to highlight that despite several internal and external geopolitical tensions, the Antarctic Treaty Parties have always been able to adapt Antarctic governance to new challenges without losing the spirit of cooperation. And the second point that I would like to highlight today is the special responsibility of countries from the Southern Hemisphere and with strong commonalities such as Argentina and Australia in safeguarding the Antarctic Treaty values. Well, as it was mentioned, I am coming from Argentina, and when we talk about Antarctica, this is just not a curious fact. There are many affinities between Argentina and Australia. Both countries are characterized by their agricultural resources, the industrial development, their population, weather, and geographical situation in the Southern Hemisphere. And more importantly, both countries are neighbors at the South Pole and sit side by side at the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings. Like Australia, Argentina has a direct interest in Antarctica and based on several legal titles, considers that the Argentinian Antarctic sector is an integral part of its territory. And also, like Australia, the Argentinian fauna, flora, weather, environment are related to Antarctica. Clearly, what happened in Antarctica affects countries close to the continent, such as Argentina and Australia. As we know, the Antarctic region is governed by the Antarctic Treaty System, or ATS, and the Antarctic Treaty, its core instrument, arose as a response to particular regional problems. We need to remember that during the 1940s and 50s, the Antarctic geopolitical environment was complex, and there was an increased concern over the region as a potential scene of the Cold War. Tensions in the Antarctic Peninsula escalated due to the potential military conflict between three US allies, such as Argentina, Chile, and the UK, and at the same time, many uncertainties were raised after the end of the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58, when the Soviet Union decided to maintain some of the research stations established during this scientific effort. So clearly, the Antarctic Treaty is a regional response to these geopolitical tensions. Under this agreement, the countries active in the region, following the spirit of cooperation of the International Geophysical Year, agree on, among other things, the peaceful use and non-militarization of the continent and freedom of scientific research. But nothing of this would be possible if not for Article 4 of the treaty. This article has safeguarded the different interests of the countries by preserving the status quo on claims and rights. And this was an essential requirement made by countries that have asserted rights over different sectors of the Antarctic continent, such as Argentina and Australia. So Article 4 has contented both claimant and non-claimant states. Also, I would like to highlight that for countries close to the continent, their proximity to Antarctica play an important role in the negotiations of the treaty. For instance, Argentina and Australia work very closely and play a fundamental role in the adoption of the ban on nuclear explosions in Antarctica. Soon after the entry into force of the Antarctic Treaty in 1961, the parties turned their attention to other regional problems, in particular the protection of the Antarctic environment. So the Antarctic Treaty Parties adopted the agreed measures on conservation of Antarctic flora and fauna in 1964, and then in 1972, the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Seals. Nevertheless, and as I mentioned earlier, the development of Antarctic governance has been shaped by internal and external geopolitical pressures. In the 1970s, as a response to the increasing concern or the increasing commercial interest in Antarctic krill resources, the Antarctic Treaty Parties adopted in 1980 the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, also known as the Canberra Convention. The convention created a decision-making body, the Commission for Canberra, and its beautiful secretariat is located here in the city of Hobart. But if we have to think about turbulent moments in the history of Antarctic governance, we need to talk about the 1980s. When the Antarctic Treaty Parties started to negotiate a treaty on mining activities, the legitimacy of the Antarctic Treaty System was challenged by Malaysia and other developing countries at the UN General Assembly. However, these attempts of establishing a universal regime under the UN framework did not succeed thanks to the role played by the Antarctic Treaty Parties, in particular Australia, under the figure of Woolcott, in protecting the values of the Antarctic Treaty at the UN General Assembly. And again, when the 1988 Mineral Convention failed to enter into force, Australia played a key role in the adoption of the 1991 Madrid Protocol on environmental protection. This protocol is a fundamental instrument in the history of Antarctic governance. The Antarctic Treaty Parties have taken the responsibility of protecting the Antarctic environment in the interest of humankind as a whole. The Madrid Protocol designates Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. And among other things, it prohibits mining activities in the region. This period also experienced the increase in the number of the parties to the treaty. For instance, Brazil, Germany, India, and China joined the treaty during the 1980s. More recently, in 2004, and after years of internal discussions, the parties established the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat in Buenos Aires to support the functioning of the treaty. So these events show that the Antarctic Treaty is open to any country to join. And despite any internal and external geopolitical pressure, the Antarctic Treaty parties have always been able to adapt Antarctic governance to new challenges without losing the spirit of cooperation and the protection of the Antarctic Treaty values. For instance, Argentina and the United Kingdom, two original signatories and claimant states, have always cooperated in Antarctica despite their still existing territorial dispute over the Falkland Malvinas, South Georgia, and South Sandwich Island, which includes an armed conflict very close to the Antarctic Treaty area in 1982. Well, everything looks very nice until now. However, I argue that there is a danger of falling into some sort of self-congratulatory assessment of what the ATA of the Antarctic Treaty has achieved during the last 6 decades. The region is currently facing a new set of challenges that will likely call for further institutional development and governance responses. At the beginning of the 21st century, the current geopolitical environment in the international level poses a new set of challenges to Antarctic governance. For instance, recent comments have suggested that the lack of consensus to adopt decisions within both CAMELAR and the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings may be related to external geopolitical tensions. However, if there is something that we can learn from Antarctic history, is that there is no geopolitical tension that has caused the Antarctic Treaty Parties to fail to cooperate and protect the Antarctic Treaty values. The Antarctic Treaty secures values that we all desire, such as security, freedom, sustainable management of resources, or environmental protection. So the Antarctic Treaty Parties have the responsibility to ensure that the Antarctic region does not become an scene or object of international discord and continues to be a reserve, the natural reserve devoted to peace and science. So I would like to conclude by highlighting that the Antarctic Treaty has been able to successfully manage geopolitical tensions for the last 6 decades without losing the spirit of cooperation. And at its 60s, the treaty is healthy and still relevant for the region. And as the Antarctic story shows, nothing should prevent the Antarctic Treaty to continue in that way for the coming decades. To this end, the countries from the Southern Hemisphere, such as Argentina and Australia, can play an important role in safeguarding the Antarctic Treaty values. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you indeed, Bruno, for that very interesting and very comprehensive presentation. We will go to questions and discussion after the next speaker, but it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Hannah Nelson, who is joining us from New Zealand at the moment. Hannah is going to address why should we, oh, sorry, no, she's not. Hannah is going to address the Antarctic Treaty, nature, peace, and science. Hannah.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, for that. And thank you, Bruno, for that introduction to the treaty itself. So we are celebrating this year, 60 years since the Antarctic Treaty came into force. And we're in the Australian context here as well. So we'll start with a picture of this fella here. You might recognise from well before the Antarctic Treaty was even conceived of. So Douglas Mawson is who we're seeing here. And in 1913, the Australian explorer Douglas Mawson penned a series of articles for the Adelie Blizzard, the newspaper of his Australasian Antarctic expedition, where he explicitly outlined the economic value to be extracted from this continent. And that series that he wrote suggested that whaling, sealing, fox farming, wind power, sanatoria, and sightseeing could all be lucrative propositions in the far south. And although no health camps have been established in the Antarctic and foxes have stayed north of Tasmania, Mawson's other predictions have come true. We've seen wind turbines installed and marine mammals have been harvested and at times decimated. And these days, in fact, that wildlife continues to be valuable, but viewed through a very different lens, and quite literally in the case of the tourists who head down each season. So Antarctica has been seen in a whole range of ways through different lenses as a place for profit. It's been framed also, though, as a place for heroes, so where people can test their limits, a place of extremity for machinery to test itself, a place of purity, and then more recently as well, a place that is in need of protection. And although those framings of Antarctica differ depending on time and place, we might find that some of those early suggestions of Mawson, and indeed the concept of Antarctica as connected in any way to a commercial world, can be at odds with dominant notions that we have today of what Antarctica is and what it should be like looking into the future. It's often perceived as that last unexploited place on Earth, and it is governed and protected by the Antarctic Treaty System, which sets it aside as a place for peace and for science. But it hasn't always been this way. So that contemporary lens through which we view the far south, where it is figured as a place to protect, is actually relatively recent. We've got the Antarctic Treaty itself that was signed in 1959, Australia being one of those 12 original signatories. And that came into effect on the 23rd of June, 1961. And that treaty doesn't have an expiry date, but what we do see is that the addition of further instruments has reflected changing priorities. And they in turn also have an impact on the ways we interact with and do science in Antarctica today as well. So the treaty itself is a relatively simple document. We've just got the 14 articles there, including Article 4 with those territorial claims, which essentially ensures the continuance of international harmony in the Antarctic and means we could look at that as essentially a peace treaty. But today, we don't just talk about the Antarctic Treaty, we talk about the Antarctic Treaty System, because of course a lot has happened over the past 60 years. And although that document's at the heart of that system, these various instruments that have been added have addressed those concerns. So concerns about sealing, leading to that Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Seals, growing interest in the krill fishery in the Southern Ocean, leading to that Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, discussions through the 1980s and anxieties around mineral resource activity led to discussions for that framework for regulating that mineral resource activity. And that then was superseded by the 1991 Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, or the Madrid Protocol, which is at the heart of a lot of this idea of protection too. It's the Madrid Protocol that includes that ban on mining, that established the Committee for Environmental Protection and brought in a raft of other protection measures for the Antarctic. Things like requiring environmental evaluations before undertaking activities, and also banning the introduction of non-native species. So the reason we don't have dogs working in the Antarctic anymore. And it's not just about the ice of Antarctica either, but the surrounding region, and a lot of talk around the associated independent ecosystems down there as well. And in fact, it's not just the ecosystems of animals that live in the Antarctic. We also have sort of an ecosystem of diplomats, and right down to people who are working in the Antarctic too. And this takes a whole lot of effort to make this whole system function by many parties at many different levels as well. We've heard mention of that Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, where the parties are meeting once every year. And it's not just the parties. We also have invited observers and experts as well. So things like the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research is providing information about what's happening in the Antarctic and the best advice. Other key stakeholders from that wider Antarctic policy ecosystem, things like the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs, the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, or the World Meteorological Organization, all bringing different expertise to these discussions. And in fact, that wider ecosystem of knowledge holders is very important and was explicitly acknowledged this year in the 2021 Paris Declaration, which marked the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the entry into force of the Antarctic Treaty, as well as the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Madrid Protocol. And that explicitly reinforces the value of the engagement of this expert advice in order to make those best possible decisions. And as has been observed, these meetings are quite remarkable in that parties have attended even when communication in other international forums may not be going as well as possible. So really demonstrating the strength of international cooperation. And they are usually held in person, often in warmer climates, quite removed from the chill of Antarctica itself. But as has been noted, 2021 was an exception thanks to that coronavirus pandemic. We had a virtual format, which poses its own challenges in relation to time zones and connectivity and the pared down agenda as well. But I have to say, in the Hobart context at 2 o'clock in the morning, that connection to Antarctica did feel very strong with that chill right there on the doorstep. But those discussions that happen in that Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting forum do have an impact on the sorts of things we do down in Antarctica, and also the way that we do those. So what do we do in the Antarctic? Well, two big activities, science and tourism. The main ways that people get down south are associated with these two here. Science, of course, one of the pillars of the Antarctic Treaty System, and cooperation is really key here. Article 2 of the treaty talks about the freedom of scientific investigation in Antarctica and cooperation toward that end, as applied during the International Geophysical Year. And of course, science has come a long way over the past 60 years. The sorts of things that we undertake might look quite different, but some of the principles are still there. Things like the sharing of information and data, cooperation between expeditions and stations, particularly in terms of capacity building for newer polar nations as well. The Madrid Protocol has implications for how we do science. For instance, those environmental evaluations that take place before undertaking new activities, whether those are associated with infrastructure or other activities. And then at the meetings, we'll see reports on activity that's underway, invitations to join new projects, advice from the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, with the idea that the decisions made should be on that best available science there. And even though Antarctica is often seen as a place for science, we should remember that idea of peace as well, peaceful activities. And in fact, tourism is a peaceful activity that brings the most number of people to Antarctica each year, particularly pre-pandemic. So in the 2019-20 season, we saw just over 74,000 tourists heading south mainly in the Antarctic Peninsula region, leaving from South America, and mainly ship-based. And although that activity began back in the 1950s, we've seen quite major growth since the 1990s. And the way that we operate in that forum, it also links back to discussions and decisions in the Antarctic Treaty arena as well. One example is the wilderness and aesthetic values that are mentioned in the Madrid Protocol and protected are really one of the big draw cards for the tourists coming down south. And that idea of protecting the place and preventing the introduction of non-native species, for instance, means that before going on landings, you do things like cleaning jackets, including looking for seeds in the Velcros, and scrubbing boots as well to try to prevent the introduction of any pests down there. Now that activity is of interest to the Antarctic Treaty Parties as well. It's discussed regularly at the meetings as an agenda item. And in that Paris Declaration from this year too, the parties reaffirmed their commitment to regulate tourism and non-governmental activities in an effective manner, including addressing challenges arising from regulatory compliance, potential growth, and diversification of activities. So it's an ongoing area of interest. It's something that to date has been more managed rather than regulated, so by the industry side of things. Part of the reason for that is to do with how decisions are made, with consensus being at the heart of the Antarctic Treaty system. Some decisions can be quite slow, and it can be quicker to make change, for instance, on the level of the operators than in this other forum. But they're both important aspects to mention when we think about human activity down in the Antarctic. And how do we sort of know what is happening down there? Well, a few ways we can do that, both from near and from far. So I mentioned inspections here because that brings us back to the treaty as well. And to promote the objectives and ensure the observance of the provisions of the treaty said contracting parties could designate observers to carry out inspections down in the far south. And initially that related to the peace aspect of the treaty, the way to make sure that there weren't stockpiles of nuclear weapons being kept down there, particularly in the context of the Cold War. But today that also relates very much to the Madrid Protocol, checking for what's happening on that environmental side of things there. And that links to cooperation, transparency, and openness. And those inspection reports are all available through the Antarctic Treaty website, along with responses as well. What we do in Antarctica, though, can look quite different now to what it did 60 years ago. And I've written here from afar because we've got this increasing capacity to do really important work in and about Antarctica from a distance, whether that's modeling work back home or whether it's using remote sensing or things like satellite imagery to learn more about the far south. It may not have been available a decade ago, let alone 60 years ago, when the Antarctic Treaty was first signed and came into effect. And that in itself can lead to further challenges, things like dual scientific and military use of communication activity, technology, for instance. But again, I think it's really important to return to those principles of the treaty, that peace, that science, and that cooperation. And this new technology and remote work can also be really helpful for addressing pressing challenges, for instance, of climate change, because it's a way of also reducing human footprints in particular locations. So it's not just what we do in Antarctica, but also what we do back home that's really important. And in fact, when we're looking at this growing awareness of the connectedness of Antarctica throughout global systems, that oceans and ice and atmosphere, we can also be thinking about this policy side of things too. And it makes the Antarctic Treaty system even more important, because maintaining stability in the region geopolitically and environmentally actually has implications for places far away as well across the globe. So if we're looking forward and thinking about what do we need and what's coming, I think we do need to celebrate what we have, which is an enduring and dynamic system that has weathered many challenges. And there are challenges to come as well. Things like climate change, that consensus decision-making, the expiry myth. So the treaty doesn't actually expire. What we need for that is trust. We need to be making sure we're investing in capacity building, but also the resources to allow science to happen in Antarctica, science being the currency down there essentially. We need to remain responsive to concerns and be thinking about how this treaty system interacts with other regimes there. So it's not just what happens on the ground in Antarctica. The governance structures and also public perception of those governance structures play important roles. And having confidence in the system is important because the lack of confidence can undermine the strength of the system itself. So when considering what kind of a future we want to see for Antarctica and how we understand our connections with the far south, it can be useful to look back on past visions on what could have been. For instance, Douglas Mawson's fox farms, to help us articulate what we think is important today. And science plays a central role, but it's not just scientists who hold the keys to the future. And nor should it be, because the question of what kind of a future we want to see is a very human question. It's based on the values and priorities of people living far from the ice itself. And we need to keep in mind that the way we understand Antarctica today is not the way it always has been, nor the way it will necessarily be seen into the future. So on the 23rd of June this year, we celebrated 60 years since the Antarctic Treaty came into force, which means it's an ideal time to reflect on what we value most about the far south and why that is. Whether that's how our relationship with marine wildlife has changed over time, and what ways our policy changes have impacted how we undertake science, or more existentially, what does it mean to interact with Antarctica in the Anthropocene when the impacts of human activity are being felt even in the most remote parts of the Earth. What we do have in the Antarctic Treaty System is a living framework. It has responded to many challenges in the past. So I think this is a great opportunity to open that conversation about Antarctica, celebrate and learn from what has gone before, and work together to ensure that the protection of the far south is never taken for granted, and that the Antarctic Treaty System continues to adapt for another 60 years and beyond. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. Very interesting. Now, for those who have come in online, you have the ability to start asking questions now. For those in the Aurora Theatre, some of us will be joining you, not the New Zealanders, but some of us will be joining you down in the Aurora Theatre at the end of this session. I would now like to open the seminar up to questions, but I'm going to start off by asking a particular question of Hannah to start off with, and that is, what is the role of tourism in Antarctica? You often see articles written about the perils of Antarctic tourism and how bad it is. You've been an observer of human activity in Antarctica for quite some time. How do you see the role of tourism in Antarctica?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tony. And tourism is a really big activity down in the far south. If we look at sort of where the people going south are coming from what activity, and tourism is right up there with the around just over 74,000 in the last season, and that had been growing. Look, I think tourism is a legitimate activity. I think it's quite an important activity as well for making sure that Antarctica is not just the domain of very few people. It is very difficult to get down there. We have access through national Antarctic programs or through tourism, which is also very expensive and can be quite difficult to access as well. I think what we have seen in recent years too is many of these operators, particularly in conjunction with IATO, that International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, trying to link up and make opportunities also for these science voyages to either be bringing scientists, tour voyages to bring scientists down as well, or to have citizen science on board. And this idea too of creating Antarctic ambassadors, so bringing people back home who talk about that place and share ideas about that place back home. And I think that's really important to get people talking about and aware of the far south, and not to have it locked off as a place no one can visit. Having said that, there are challenges lying ahead, and there are conversations to be had about what sort of activity we give social license to sort of as a global community.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Bruno a question, because this was a part of your seminar, Bruno. The importance of consensus. One of the other criticisms that we get about the Antarctic Treaty System is that it relies on consensus, and sometimes it's difficult to get difficult decisions, hard decisions made. Do you see consensus as being an obstacle or a builder of the Antarctic Treaty System, and how do you manage consensus?
Thank you very much, Tony. Very interesting question. So the consensus-based decision-making is in the heart of the Antarctic Treaty System. In Antarctic governance, consensus does not mean that everyone must agree. If not, it's the absence of formal objection. So consensus reflects the spirit of cooperation of the treaty. Clearly, now that we have 29 consultative parties, 28 states, plus the European Union, it's a little bit harder to reach the required consensus to adopt any decision. But as I explained in my presentation, Antarctic governance has not been free from internal and external geopolitical pressures. However, the success of the Antarctic Treaty relies on the ability of the parties to handle them peacefully, seeking general consensus. So I firmly believe that the Antarctic consensus-based mechanism is still relevant for the current and future challenges.
Thank you. There's been a lot of recent writing that has produced a language of militarization into the Antarctic discourse. Of course, as Robert Menzies pointed out, Antarctica was not being demilitarized by the Antarctic Treaty, but because it was non-militarized. And one of the big benefits of the Antarctic Treaty over the last 60 years has been that non-militarization. But in academic discourse at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about military maneuvers and the like. And I've got a question from the audience here. It says, how do you respond to recent academic commentary that the treaty is not fit for purpose and needs to be replaced? Or the views that militarization is happening and that Australia should put responsibility for Antarctica, for instance, into the Defence Department? I won't ask our Argentinian colleague to answer that question. I'll ask Hannah Nielsen to answer that question, and then Bruno might comment directly afterwards.
Yes, well, I think it's useful that the Antarctic Treaty is getting attention and is getting scholarly attention, and also more widely as well, particularly at this juncture, 60 years. I do think that it is a really remarkable thing that this treaty has been able to stay in effect for this long. And also, I think one of its strengths is that it has been able to respond to those challenges as they've come up. So this talk about the treaty not being fit for purpose, I mean, is it perfect? Absolutely not. Can there be scope for improvements? Yes. But I do think that what we have there is really something quite remarkable. And if we were to try to come up with a system today with all the other pressures that are happening geopolitically and the like, that we would not end up with a solution like what we have. And I think the outcomes could actually be worse for the Antarctic region itself. It would see a lot less stability, and it would be worse for science and scientists and access as well. In regards to the view that that Australia should put responsibility for Antarctica with the Defence Department, and I guess this comes back also to some of these views about Antarctica and who is it for, and in Australia with that pre-existing claim to 42% of the continent. I do think it's worth looking back over those 60 years, though, since the treaty came into effect, and the cooperation that's been happening between these different nations there as well, and what that has enabled. And again, it's coming back to that spirit of cooperation in science and also across a lot of other realms. And that is worth keeping in mind rather than perhaps thinking specifically from just one country's viewpoint. So remember that with those claims as well, it's only really the claimant nations that are recognising those. And my colleague Bruno may have something to say on that too, given some of the similarities and differences between Australia and Argentina in that regard.
Bruno?
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Tony. Very interesting issue. We always have to remember that Article 1 prohibits any use of Antarctica that is not peaceful. So we have to keep in mind that Antarctica should be, and is the object and the responsibility of the Antarctic Treaty Parties to keep Antarctica, or to Antarctica should be kept out of any international conflict, or should not be object or an scene of an international conflict. So having said that, we need to pay attention when we raise these kind of discourses, because the Antarctic Treaty Parties have the responsibility to comply with the Antarctic Treaty, and Article 1 is one of the key provisions. So when we have this idea of involved military personnel or the defense, we have to always think about Article 1 and the peaceful use of the Antarctic continent, and clearly the non-militarization of the continent.
Thank you. Thank you. On a related matter, which is to do with verification of what's of activities in Antarctica. Hannah, we've got a question from the audience that says, what importance do you ascribe to the spontaneous inspection of stations of other nations to verify what everybody is actually doing?
Yeah, so we do have inspections down in the Antarctic, and it actually takes quite a lot of work and quite a lot of cooperation in order to sort of get these inspections working. They're often done by more than one party working together, and they'll often visit multiple stations and field sites, and also tour sites as well in that season there. I think it is important to have that as a function in order to make sure we've got this transparency. But what happens is there'll be notification of who are those inspectors. And then this is all getting tabled at these meetings as well. So writing each party that did the inspections, what they found, what were their recommendations, hopefully helping to improve the practice of those who've been inspected, who then will also respond. So I think that it is a really important part that we have there in the treaty, but it does also take a lot of work behind the scenes. It's not that you take an airplane one day and drop in. There is also a lot of cooperation between different nations to make this possible.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. How likely is it that mining will become an allowable activity under the treaty? Bruno, I'll go to you first.
Thank you. This is also something that we usually read or listen on the media. We need to remember that the Madrid Protocol and the ban on mining activities does not expire. That's the first issue that we have to remember. So up to until 2048, if we need to remove the ban, we will need the agreement of all the Antarctic Treaty Parties. And even then, what the treaty has established is that any country can call for a conference to review the Madrid Protocol, but despite that, the mechanism to change the mining ban is very complex. And we also need to have another regime governing that activity in force in order to change it. And we also have to remember that the Antarctic Treaty has a similar provision for 1991, and non-states have called for a review conference. So obviously we will always have this kind of discussion on mining activities, but I don't see that the ban will be removed in the near future. I don't see that that will be very likely.
Hannah, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I'd make a comment there that this is also coming back to the values that we hold and the ways that we are viewing Antarctica, and keeping in mind that in the past, some of the activities that have been undertaken there, we might not feel the same way about that anymore. For instance, the way that we might get power down there. So there was a nuclear power station, for instance, that when that was introduced, came in the 1960s at McMurdo Station, was greeted with this is the future and it's going to enable all kinds of new activity, and it didn't quite work out that way. There's a bit of hillside missing and a little plaque because it's a historic site now. But some of those views that we've held in the past for what Antarctica could look like are not what we have now. Bruno's recognised that sort of framework that we have in place in terms of the Antarctic Treaty System, but I also think what is important to reflect on is what are those views that we're holding back home? What stories do we tell about the place? Because that has a lot of power too in terms of what we think we'd like to see going forwards.
Thank you. I just point out that I've looked at the mathematics of actually trying to lift the current ban on mining in Antarctica, and it's a very, very difficult diplomatic result to get, particularly because of the original signatories to the Madrid Protocol in the late 1980s, 1990s. I'd just like to change tack here, and I know neither of you are deeply embedded in physical and chemical sciences, but this a couple of people have approached this issue, and that is, what does climate change mean for how Antarctica is governed and the future of the Antarctic Treaty system, and what implications does it have for how the Antarctic Treaty might develop? Hannah?
Yeah, well, I guess climate change, what it does is it really brings to the fore that Antarctica is part of the globe on which we're all living. The things that we do back home are having impacts down in the Antarctic, and also things that happen in the Antarctic can affect us back home as well. In terms of sort of the governance there, we need to be thinking about how these different regimes are talking to each other, and they don't always recognise these boundaries. For instance, there's a lot of discussion at the treaty meetings about climate change in relation to science in the Antarctic, but also recognition that there are other international instruments like the Paris Agreement that are dealing with this too. So think about how they are articulating with each other and trying to avoid any conflicts there too. I mean, how do you make sure that you are protecting Antarctica and these values that are mentioned in the treaty and the Madrid Protocol, for instance? And it is a standing agenda item at those meetings as well.
Bruno?
Well, I want to raise another point of view that Antarctica could also help us to better understand climate change. That is why scientific research in Antarctica is important. For instance, the drilling of ice core in Antarctica will help us to better understand climate change. That's why we need to protect the Antarctic environment, and keep in mind that Madrid Protocol established under Annex 2, especially how any activity carried out in Antarctica must be done under the Madrid Protocol. So what I wanted to raise is the other perspective of this issue, is that Antarctica could help us to better understand climate change, and that's why we need to better invest in science in Antarctica.
Thank you. Look, we've got a lot of questions. We're coming near to the end of our time. And I'm really sorry that I won't be able to get to all of the questions this evening, but I would like to just finish this interaction between myself and the two speakers with the questions about environmental protection. There's been a number of questions about environmental protection in Antarctica, questions like how do you regard the Davis runway, or how do you manage environmental protection from visitation or pollution, or how do you deal with other developments in Antarctica? My question to both of you to round off the evening from your point of view is, how important is environmental protection, and where do we go in the future? Bruno.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, absolutely. Environmental protection is a key issue of Antarctic governance. So that's why it's very important to follow the provision of the Madrid Protocol and their annexes. That's why it will be very important to Annex 6 to find out how to see if that Annex 6 finally is into force. That would be very important. And also I would like to raise that both at the Madrid Protocol and at the domestic level, all countries must comply with the domestic legislation in order to carry out any activity in Antarctica. So I believe that the environmental protection is under the special responsibility of all the states that are carrying out the activities in Antarctica, and they must follow the legal framework both at the international level and at their national legislation.
And Hannah, one last comment from you on that, or any other thing you may wish to comment on.
Yeah, well, I think that environmental protection is hugely important in the Antarctic. It's a very special environment on a whole range of different levels, both because of its role in global systems and for anyone who has some kind of a connection with that place, whether it's from reading stories about that place or seeing images of it, or being lucky enough to go down there yourself and encounter that ice. It's a place that really captures imaginations and also can tell us so much about not only the past of this planet that we live on, but I think also be a really useful point for sparking those discussions about the future as well. And so I would also say to everyone listening here today that an imagined version that you are thinking about, that you're carrying there in your mind, is also a really important and really powerful thing when we're talking about the protection of Antarctica going forwards too.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you very much, Bruno. And I'll hand over to Marcus.
Thanks, Tony, and to Hannah and to Bruno. A really interesting and stimulating panel. I think a very apposite set of observations reflecting on the 60th anniversary of both the entry into force and, more appropriate for this week, the first meeting of the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting in Canberra in July 1961. The Antarctic Treaty Meeting is a critical element of the governance of the Antarctican region. And in a sense, 60 years ago, one of the visitors to Australia made the commentary that given the temperature outside the meeting room, which was in what we call now the old Parliament House, which was a typical Canberra winter day, it was a very appropriate place to discuss matters about Antarctica. Nonetheless, this has been a very warm and illuminating conversation. I'd like to thank again the panel on your behalf, Hannah Nielsen, Bruno Arpi, two of our emerging early career researchers working on Antarctic matters at the University of Tasmania, and of course thank Tony Press for his moderation. If you've enjoyed this forum, consider joining the Australian Institute of International Affairs to hear about the events that they are running regularly, both nationally and locally. The evenings at talk will be available soon on the video and podcast through the university's sites, the Island of Ideas website, and the link that's shown there. You'll notice that there is coming up the Arthur Cobbold Memorial Lecture next week, and please contact the university if you're interested in that. Island life may have changed in the current situation, but the University of Tasmania is looking forward to improving the ways we communicate and keep ideas going. So thank you for taking part in tonight's discussion, and have a good evening. Thank you.